friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using Lawn Fawn's Shallow Friend, Mermaid for You, You Are Sublime, and Fantastic Friends. I stamped the images on Catherine Pooler Favorite White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink, and I'll be coloring with my Copic markers. I'm starting with the little shrimp because I absolutely love him so much. I think he is so stinking cute. And I'm going to use R00, R11, R20, and R22. For the main part of his body and also the center of my clamshell, I'm using the lightest 3 shades, and then I'm going to go over every other stripe and his tail with the darkest 3 shades. So I'm using R22, blending out with R20, and then the R11 for a highlight, just to give it a little bit of contrast. I'll also color in one of these corals with the darker pink combo so I can tie that in somewhere else in the scene. And I will be coloring a few extra of these little corals and plants on a separate sheet of cardstock, which I'll show you when I'm done. I'm going to give all of my little critters some rosy cheeks while I have these markers out, using the R22 first, blending over that with the R20, and then I'll blend that out even further with the R11. Sometimes I do this after I have finished coloring an image, or sometimes I do it before. It doesn't really matter. Either way, it'll still show up as long as you don't color over them too darkly. Next, I'm going to use some hot pinks. I'm using RV11, RV13, and RV14, and I will do the inside of the shell on the back, and I'll also do another one of these coral plants and the little scales down the seahorse's back. Starting with that RV14, using that for my shadowed areas, I'll blend over the edge of that with the RV13, and then use that RV11 for a highlight. I want to have some really fun, summery, almost neon shades for this card today, just to give it some punch. Moving into orange, I'm using YR02, YR04, and YR07. So I'm starting with the YR07, and I'm going to do another one of these plants and the small closed clamshell. And I'm being really careful with those darker colors on that clam so that I don't accidentally cover up his rosy cheeks or his face too much. And then I'm going to move into yellow. I'll use Y02, Y06, and Y08 for the fish at the top. And I'm also going to do the starfish right below him, with the Y08 being my shadow shade, and then the Y06 is my midtone, and the Y02 is going to be the highlight. I decided I wanted to have one other element yellow, so I did these other kind of kelp grasses over toward the right, and then I'm going to switch to purples. The combo that I went for is V12, V15, and V17, and I'm going to do the open clamshell and the seahorse, and I am placing that V17 on the edges of the bottom of the clamshell, and then I also put a little touch of that into the low points of the scallop along the top of the shell to create some extra dimension there, and then I'm blending out with the V15 and then using the V12 for the highlight. Same on the seahorse, just doing that in a different direction so that its face stays nice and light. I'll bring in my greens, which is going to be YG01, YG05, and YG07. For my seaweed, I'm going to fill them in completely with the YG01. Then I'll add a touch of the YG07 closest to the base of each leaf. And then I'm going to go back in with the YG05 and just blend out the edge of that YG07. I'm not going to go completely over the whole thing. I'm going to leave the ends with just the YG01 to create some extra contrast. And then for the other grasses, I used only the darkest two shades, the YG05 and the YG07. For my rocks, I'm going to bring in E70 and E71. I didn't want to get too dark with these, so I only went as dark as the E71. But once I've blended it out, I will go back and do a second layer of that E71 and just leave it. Then I'll bring in that extra panel and trim all of these images out with their matching dies. For my background, I'm starting with a piece of Bristol Smooth Surface cardstock, and I'm going to take 3 of the circle stackables and arrange those on my panel and figure out where I want those to go. And then once I have that placement, I'm going to grab a pencil and trace around them. So I'm using them as a template because later I am going to create a panel with 3 windows that I want to look down onto this panel. So I just need to make sure that I have those circles defined so that I can ink blend in the right places and make sure that all of this area is covered. Then I'm going to do my ink blending, and I'm going to do some sand and some sea in each of these windows. So I'm starting with the sand portion, and I'm using some antique linen distress oxide ink at the bottom for that. And it doesn't have to be super precise because a lot of it is going to get covered up by the imagery. I just want to have like vague patches of color. Then I'm going to darken that up with some gathered twigs, just adding a few little taps of that kind of towards the bottom of the antique linen. And then I'll go back to that antique linen ink blending tool and kind of smooth that out. But it's okay if it looks a little bit patchy because sand is, granular and it's not super smooth. So I'm going to bring in my blue shades now for the sea, and I'm going to start with Salvage Patina. And I'm going to bring that down into the antique linen so it kind of just overlaps it just slightly so that it looks like the sand is actually underwater and that it is, kind of mixed in with the water and not like its own separate thing. So once I have that laid in, I'll bring in peacock feathers, and I am barely tapping that ink blending tool onto that pad because I only want a little bit of that. I would just want to darken up that Salvage Patina. I don't want to have too much dark color because I'm working in these small little circles of space. I'll go back to that Salvage Patina and just blend over that, add a little bit more of the peacock feathers as needed, and blend again until I'm happy with how this looks. I'll set that aside to dry and switch my attention to the window panel. So I've just taken another piece of white cardstock and trimmed that down with the largest of the large stitch rectangle stackables to give it that stitching detail. And now I'm going to take those same 3 circle stackables and line them back up. And then I'm going to tape them into place with a little bit of Post-it tape, just making sure I have them evenly spaced from each other and also from the edges of the card. And then I'll run that through my die cutting machine. And once I've done that, I can pop out those little dies, and I can save that negative circle for another project if I'd like to, but I'm left with these little windows that are going to look down into this little ocean scene. So I've added a whole bunch of foam tape to the back of this panel so it will be really well supported. And I'm going to peel off those release papers and I'm going to line that up over top of the blended background. Make sure I have that right where I want it, and then I'll press that down so that the foam tape picks up the background panel. I'm actually going to have two sentiments on today's card, and I am stamping those in the large bubble clusters from Shello Friend, and then I've also got a smaller bubble cluster. I'm doing the outline in Peacock ink, and then the sentiments I'm going to do in VersaFine Onyx Black ink, just to make sure they really stand out with all of the other elements that I've got going on in this card. And then I'm going to also stamp on the inside of my card. I have scored and folded an A2 standard size card out of Mermaid cardstock, and I'm going to stamp in that same Peacock ink that I used for the bubbles. And the You're a Fantastic Friend and the bubble cluster are from Shello Friend, and then the small fish is from Fantastic Friends. So now I'm ready to start assembling and figuring out where all of these little elements are going to go. I want each of these little circular windows to be its own mini scene that are going to tie together. And I want to make them as bright and full and cheerful as I can. So I am just going to start gluing things down. I'm using my glue tube, and I will also use some foam tape so that I have different layers of dimension in each of these little scenes. And I'm going to make sure that I'm using a mixture of colors and images so that I can make it, as interesting as possible. I'm also going to let some of these elements kind of hang over the edge of the window just to make it feel a bit more expansive, like it's so full that it's actually coming out the edges. So this card is actually inspired by another Lawn Fawn card that I created 5 years ago. I recently came across a picture of that card, and I just really liked the layout. It's something very different from what I typically create, and I thought it might be fun to try to recreate that with a new and different twist. So obviously the Shello Friend stamp set is brand new, so we've got some different elements that I'm including with some of the other stamp sets that I did use on that original card. But that card was also a birthday card, so it had some other stamp sets involved. I didn't do any ink blending on that one, so I'm just trying to be inspired by that card, but also kind of step things up a bit and make it unique to where I am in my card making today. Also, the color palette was inspired by that original card, but I stepped it up by adding in a few extra shades like the softer pink and the orange. But I think it's kind of fun sometimes to take a little stroll down memory lane and look back at the cards that you created maybe a couple of years ago if you've been doing this a long time, and just see how your skills as a card maker and an artist have developed over time, and maybe be inspired by some of your old designs, but also recognize that there might be some things that you would do differently now. Not that it's necessarily better or worse, but just more in keeping with the card maker that you are today. So I'm finishing up these 3 little scenes with these last few elements, adding those finishing touches, and then I've got one little bubble cluster that I'm going to place above the yellow fish to kind of break up some of the white space between the bottom circle and the top circle. And then I am going to glue this to the front of my card. Just make sure that my card is opening the correct way. And then I'll add some more of that glue tube to the back of that panel. Line that up so it's nice and straight and press that down into place. Then I wanted to finish this off with a little bit of sparkle and shine. So I've got some clear sequins that I am just picking up and adding a little bit of glue underneath and then setting them back into place. And then I'm going to let these dry for about a minute, And then I'm going to add even more sparkle, taking some Stardust stickles, and I'm going to fill in all of the centers of these sequins. And I will also add it to some of my stamped images just to have a little bit of accent here and there. I put it on the fins of my seahorse, on the darker stripes of my shrimp, and then along the sides of some of my coral and plants, on the starfish and the small clamshell, on the inner part of the larger clamshell, and along the edges of the fish's fins, just kind of here and there on some of the coral, wherever I thought it would kind of just add a little nice, interesting element to catch the eye when this card is tipped into the light. And that is going to finish up this card, so I'll lift it up so you can see it in a bit more detail and give you another peek at the inside. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, please go ahead and give it a like. This will also be on the Lawn Fawn blog and YouTube channel today, so if you'd like to watch it again, you can check it out over there, and I would so appreciate the support. Make sure to leave me a comment and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Ring that notification bell if you want to be alerted when I post new videos. All the products I use will be listed and linked in the description bar below the video, and I'll also add 2 extra videos to the end screen in case you'd like to keep watching. Thanks so much for spending your time with me. I hope you had a good one, and I'll see you soon in the next. Bye-bye!